My name is Lacey and I am in the Friday ECS 410 class, and I'm just here to give my reflection on assessment this semester. Don't mind me and my vehicle, my dog will not stop barking, so I will be making the best out of the situation. So starting us off, the individual reflection assessment philosophy and how that's grown for me. When I first started this class, I thought that assessment and being an effective assessor would be just finding creative ways to assess, but I thought that meant more so creative questions to put on an exam. There wasn't much thought into not having an exam at all and doing presentations or a completely different method instead. It was more sort of coming up with a way to adapt an actual test. So that's been really interesting. I looked at it more of a final way to judge a student's comprehension throughout the semester, and attending classes, listening and participating in discussions, observing and paying attention to what Kristen, yourself, how you instructed and modeled, as far as even just letting us hand things in a few days late if we were needing that extra time, and just my own assessment experience during pre-internship. It is extremely obvious that assessment goes beyond writing a number in a report card. I believe that assessment is revolving and it's an ongoing factor, and it's an ongoing assessment throughout the entire year or semester you have with your students. So from looking at assessment as a final way to judge someone on an exam or to test them on that, I look at it now as focusing on more of assessing students to improve their learning. So looking at it as a way to not only look at the students' product, but looking at my own teaching as well and how that is coming across. So what is assessment? It depends on who you would ask, I think, and what their learning theory is. I consider myself to be a constructivist / humanist when it comes to my learning theory. So I look at assessing as the way teachers support and assess children's learning, monitoring progress instead of monitoring just milestones, identifying the next steps and recognizing student achievements through a range of qualifications, not just a standard. However, the typical assessment response would just be a way to see if a student understands the topic or curriculum, concepts, outcomes, and indicators, and seeing where the students are at. A representation of how well a teacher teaches and how well a student understands said teaching, and forming opinions on the student's ability to perform an outcome or demonstrate a competency / literacy. So I do think those are important and more of the milestone type of assessments. I do see the value in those, but I think there are better ways to do it. So for example, instead of looking at assessment as a representation of how well a teacher teaches and how well that student understands the teaching, is to make sure that your teaching is differentiated and that your students' needs are being met. Because assessing one student who may be, an honor roll top of the class may be different and should be different, I believe, than how you assess an EAL student who is in their first year in an English-speaking country. So that's my view on what assessment is. So just reiterating that I think it is the way teachers support and assess children's learning. There are also different types of assessment. So the first one I went over is teacher assessment, how we assess students in our class, but there is also self-assessment. So self-assessment in our week 5 slide says that it leads to increased responsibility for their own learning. It develops student capacity for critical thinking and helps students to be independent learners. It also states that research indicates that self-assessment is crucial to improved learning and encourages students to set higher learning goals and provide greater feedback and effort to their learning. It also shows that self-assessment, when properly implemented, provides students and teachers with reliable information about student achievement. I'm not sure how I personally feel about self-assessment. I definitely see the value in it. However, in our group discussion, we discussed how how you look at yourself and your self-value can really affect how you assess yourself. So if I have kind of low self-value or really high expectations and I don't feel like I did 120%, I may rate myself at, say, a 6 or 7 out of 10 when my peers and my teacher may be assessing me at, say, an 8 or a 9. I think that happens quite a bit. I myself have been a victim. I've self-victimized by giving myself poor marks because I knew that I went to bed, say, an hour earlier one night instead of staying up really late and working on an assignment, and it bothered me, and I felt that I didn't give it everything I had. Therefore, I mark myself quite harshly. I just think it's important maybe to self-assess, but maybe not value that assessment. At the university level, it might be a bit different to actually put a mark on it in the summative area, but I think for growing and developing students, perhaps self-assessment could be more of just more of a tool to keep in check, especially with group projects and whatnot. More of accountability, I guess, is the word I'm looking for. But I don't think in the developing years through elementary and high school that should be worth a mark. Peer feedback is another form of feedback we discussed quite a bit this semester, and the week 5 slides say that it allows students to develop and practice their skills in giving and receiving feedback, and that students tend to be more receptive to feedback from their peers, and they use language that they can readily understand. They also say that students may experience challenges initially with using the success criteria and descriptive feedback effectively, so they will need support and scaffolding for this. Giving students feedback on the quality of their peer assessments helps focus on the strengths and linking feedback to success criteria. And the content of the feedback, so what was done well, what needs to improve, and how to improve. So that's the idea of peer assessment. I think there's some variables here that could make this work or work against a student. I think it depends on the age group, but I believe that in high schools and elementary school, once again, that we shouldn't be linking this to a summative grade. I think that peer feedback could be really great as far as just helpful notes and, like it said, language that is easy to read and understand to the other peer. However, I think there could be just too many issues with perhaps not liking a student, or a student gets paired with a bully, or even the other way around, a student who maybe isn't a high achiever gets paired with someone who has really high standards and doesn't think that their work is good enough, even though they are, getting high 90s. It could be a way to push that student, but I just fear that it might not be as effective as we hope. Although studies do say otherwise. I just wonder sometimes if these studies are done in classrooms that are typical, or maybe where there is behavioral issues, or if these studies are done in classes that are perhaps like AB programs or IP programs. So I think there's a lot of variables. I'd like to see a complete random blind test done to see if peer assessments are actually credible. However, the class is telling me otherwise, the research is telling me otherwise, so I look forward to trying this out in my own classroom eventually and seeing how it goes. Along with peer and self-assessment, I think teacher assessment is important as well in other areas, more in the feedback category. So conferencing is a way that I think is a great way to get that student engagement and interaction. To sit down with students and hear out their plans, and if students aren't getting good at getting their thoughts on paper, it's a great way for them to describe things to you orally. This is also a good way for teachers to give feedback without having to spend hours marking, especially in the case of a quick turnaround, such as if you're wanting to have a review of a draft or a thesis statement before they start an essay. So I think it's important to be mindful of your feedback practices, making sure that it is helpful, it's thought-provoking, makes an impact, and keeping in mind that what you say to students carries a lot of weight. I think this is a great way to give feedback and help students get on their feet and get going on assignments that will give them better assessment, well, not better assessment, but better skills to get the assessment that they are hoping for. So how do we know that a student understands, knows, and is able to do something? This is a tough one. I think it's really important that we back away from our multiple choice tests and get away from that Scantron, even light it on fire, and really look for progress of learning. I think it's essential that we see students showing progress from day one to the last day and assessing them based on their progress as opposed to just yes or no answers. I think it's important also to give students a way of showing understanding that best fits their needs. So possibly an essay or drawing a picture or creating some artwork, making a video, even writing a song or writing a rap, whatever the students find as a way that they can show you their understanding while also using a method that works for you. I think there should be no problem with that. Obviously there is outcomes that we have to hit, so hopefully we can kill two birds with one stone there, but I think it's important. Also in week 5 slides it says modeling, so students can see what is being asked of them, and once familiar with the success criteria they can go into their own work. I think that's important too, is giving your students some space, modeling to them what you want, or going through the rubrics or success criteria, making it very clear what the outcome needs to be as far as this is what I need to see that you can do. But otherwise, backing off and giving some creative space to your students. And for those students who aren't into the creative realms, they can just do something standard as far as writing a paper, for example. Me personally, I probably would have loved just doing a paper, but it's nice to give those options so that every student can take advantage of their strengths. I personally have a humanistic approach to my methods of teaching and assessment. When I was looking into it, I found a journal called Constructivist Teaching by Zahorix in 1995, so it's a bit old, but it talks about how assessment includes application of knowledge and comprehension, that assessment is a range of techniques used. Assessment must focus on the big picture of concepts and their accompanying facts and evidence. And I really love that last point, because when I was teaching this past semester at the pre-internship, I found that I was teaching old material, old content such as Of Mice and Men, and I wanted to find a way to make this connect with my students. So every day we did a set that connected the major themes of the book to modern day issues. So for example, we talked a lot about physical disability, and I linked that to some of the survivors of the Humboldt Broncos crash and how they are managing now with physical disability. And I want to take those connections between the two. So on their final exam for the Mice and Men, I wanted them to focus on the big concepts and not necessarily focus on Lenny and George and their story, but more of how their story makes them feel different about the world they live in. So I think it's really important to focus on the bigger picture and maybe less on facts such as what color was someone's dress or what year was this written in. Although those do have their place, I'm just not sure if that's what we need to be focusing their assessment on. A few issues that I have seen with assessment in my pre-internship and just in class discussion is just trying to find ways to fit in these new ideas into older outcomes. So even looking through the Saskatchewan Evaluation, a Teacher's Handbook, it was interesting because they talked a lot about self-assessment and the importance of it, as well as being careful with your verbs and your rubrics and in your criterias. They also talked about learning contracts and other things that we are using today and still kind of pushing for. However, they also talk about the importance of multiple choice and how to do a proper multiple choice and matching and other traditional forms of assessment. So I thought that was quite interesting to see that juxtaposition, how we're still working on the same things that they were working on in 91. In 1991, I was in kindergarten, so I should have seen things like self-assessment sometime from my K-12 educational experience in Saskatchewan, but I do not remember ever doing anything such as self or peer assessment in high school. I read in Assessment, Teaching, and Theories of Learning by Mary James She says that by using models of assessment borrowed from elsewhere, teachers may find themselves subscribing uncritically or unwittingly to the theories of learning on which they are based. And I thought this was really interesting as well, because as we establish our own learning theories and what's important to us and how we want to assess, we can't get caught in these traps of just borrowing material or receiving content from other teachers and teaching it, because we're not teaching what we believe in. So although it might be helpful that a teacher helps with us as we're starting out, I think it's really important that we are critically reviewing this material and making sure it aligns with our practice and our beliefs in instruction, and also that it fits what we stand for in the classroom. One class reading I really liked was the Rousel and Walsh's paper called Rethinking Literacy Education in New Times, Multimodality, Multiliteracies, and New Literacies. Here we see the multitude of new literacies. The times are changing, and therefore assessment needs to change as well. It's interesting to me that we have this fountain of new technology and new ways of doing things, yet we keep going back to these old trusty multiple choice tests and matching, when really we could be just doing tons of other different types of assessments that would be a lot more beneficial to the student. One of the quotes in there said, "We are constantly reminded in education that the mastery of the tool itself is not the outcome, but how we use it." So not necessarily just trying to get from A to B, but the process and the progress of getting from A to B is what matters more. Reminds me of that cheesy quote, "It's not the destination, it's the journey." So during my pre-internship, I had two different experiences with summative assessment. The first one was a biographical profile. So they were to interview their table mate and write a one-page MLA format, 3-paragraph essay on their partner. And I gave them a questionnaire to fill out just to get them going, get the juices flowing. I also gave them a graphic organizer so I could see some drafting and some proof of work and thought. And then they were to hand in their biographical profile to me within a week. And they got 2 class hours to work on this. And this was an interesting one because I did a success criteria checklist with that, and I was surprised by how many students did not hand in their draft work, which was worth marks. I was also completely shocked at how many students did not hand their work in on time. I got about 35 out of 65 returned on the day of, so that was a bit disappointing. But it was interesting to me to see their level of work. So in this case, I would have liked to have done a peer assessment, and that is one thing I marked on my lesson plan for next time. There was a lot of just simple errors that spell check didn't catch, for example, just not capitalizing proper nouns. Pretty simple things that I think they could have easily caught, definitely if they did a peer assessment. So I'll definitely incorporate that next time, and that would help hit an outcome as well. The other one I did was the Of Mice and Men novel study. So on the novel study, every day, like I mentioned, we did a set. We did some audiobook listening. I read out loud. We had some students read as well. And for the final test of the knowledge, we did a test, which I wasn't thrilled with, but the teacher really wanted me to do a test. So I did tons and tons of review. We went over everything multiple times before the exam day in multiple ways. We watched videos, we played a Jeopardy game. I did a lot of just class discussion and even giving them some answers, to be honest. We watched the video and they were to find some differences. So there was a lot of ways that students who maybe weren't following the book quite as well as I hoped could have done really well. I started the test with some multiple choice questions and matching. We did some short answer questions and then a essay question on their thoughts on the topics that we went over, such as racism, poverty, sexism, those types of things. And it was really interesting to get the feedback from those exams. I thought with the question about what was in the movie versus the book, as well as the essay question, would have given students an opportunity to really pull ahead, especially if they were absent for a class, or if they just had a really fueling desire to tell me about their thoughts on one of the topics, which they did show me in discussion. However, a lot of students did really, really, really well on multiple choice and terrible on the essay questions. And I thought that was really interesting because it showed me that they're able to remember these facts, but they weren't able to make the connections that I wanted them to. But yeah, I wasn't confident in that either, because during our class discussions we had great feedback and great discussion on these topics. So it really showed me that testing with a traditional paper test over an hour is for the birds, because I knew that other than 5 or 6 students per class who were just great students in general as far as the stereotypical good student, everyone else struggled in either the multiple choice or the essay questions, but mostly the essay questions. And I was not disappointed really, but just I really had to think about how we test students, because this was not a good assessment. I knew that a lot of students knew way more than they were able to get down, and yeah, I just really think that it's an unfair way to assess. So how I plan on disrupting the traditional is definitely staying away from final exams. So like I mentioned, with doing that test in the pre-internship, that just proved to me that even though you can vary the techniques of how you ask questions in an exam, it's still the same issue as far as putting kids on the spot, making them do work within an hour, only giving them so much time to produce answers. And it showed me that a lot of students who I knew more were not able to produce more, so it wasn't an effective way of assessment. So I really want to go into new creative ways of assessing, or just going into really matching my assessment to my values and philosophy on assessment. So if my philosophy is that assessment is progress, then I need to be showing that as well through my assessment, and having progress assessments instead of just final set in stone assessments. I know that rubrics are not always great because they can't stand in for feedback and they don't teach kids to be creative, but I do love the idea of the co-creation of the rubric, as well as leaving a few blanks in the bottom of the rubric to really tailor the rubric for that specific student. I really love the idea of checklists and success criteria as well. I think that if you're giving options for techniques in assessment, that you need to be very clear on what you need to see, because at the end of the day we still have to hit our outcomes in the curriculum. So I think that even if we give options for essays or a slideshow or a music video, or however your students prefer to be assessed, that they know exactly what they need to be showing you, and that's very clear to them and to you and to anyone involved. I really like the idea of conferencing as well, and perhaps using a rating scale, something they can see that's a visual as far as their growth and development throughout their assignment. I think that'd be great, because sometimes we start off thinking that we're doing really well on something and we aren't, turns out, or vice versa. We start really strong and by the time we get to the end we have actually slid back a bit because we deleted too much, or who knows. So I think that would be a really good way of assessment. So just staying really involved in your students' learning. I also just think that it's important to not be the scary teacher, the traditional teacher who's going to make you kneel on popcorn kernels behind the chalkboard. I think it's important to be a facilitator of learning and being with them every step of the way and really helping out. Not having a desk that's untouchable or zoned off, but being really in the heart of things with your students and letting them know that you're on their team. I think success for your students is success for yourself, and vice versa. And I think that if you have students that know that you're on their side and you're rooting for them and you're there to support them every step of the way, that you can have a really good relationship and assessment won't be so scary. So I think that's all I have as far as my thoughts on assessment. I'm really looking forward to getting into the classroom and just seeing what works best for me and my students, and to get assessment on our side and not something that we're scared of, but rather something that we really strive for and look forward to. So thanks so much for a great semester, and we'll talk to you soon.